Why I love horror, plus my top 15 favorite 70s horror movies. I'm going to begin this video by making a confession. I love horror movies. This may have been obvious from some of my other videos, but I've never really done much of an examination of my love for this genre before, and I think it's time I started. Horror is easily my favorite movie genre. Now don't get me wrong, some of my all-time favorite flicks are comedies or action flicks or dramas and even love stories, but horror remains my go-to genre of choice. There's plenty of shit out there of course, but also plenty of great stuff, and I'm actually rather pleased to note that, even being the cynical old fuck that I am, horror has actually undergone something of a renaissance this decade, with some really cool movies coming out of late. It's nice to see, especially for someone often rather fed up at the state of much of modern cinema. When did my love of horror begin? I couldn't say categorically, but I think I've always had a fascination for the darker stuff. Even in TV shows like Robin of Sherwood, which was one of my childhood obsessions, the episodes focused on black magic and sorcery plots such as The Swords of Wayland and Cromcruach were always my favorites. I also have a distinct memory of listening to some horror movies I probably shouldn't have as a kid. I say listening because often I would fall asleep on the couch next to my mum, but sometimes I would only be pretending to be asleep, and even just listening to some movies was enough to give me the willies. Halloween and Black Christmas are two of the films I first experienced in this form. Indeed, I didn't actually get to see the latter properly until my late teens. Two of my most potent memories are two movies I did get to see even though I was still a kid, much to my parents' latter regret, namely the original A Nightmare on Elm Street and Fright Night, both of which scared the absolute living shit out of me. Contrary to the Looney Mary Whitehouse Brigade, however, the only psychological damage such films did was to give me a lifelong love of the genre, a love that I think it's time to start exploring in my reviews, and I absolutely intend to start exploring my favorite horror films from the 80s, 90s, 2000s and the current decade. But today I think we are going to start with the 1970s and a good old-fashioned top 10 list. Well, alright, a top 15 list anyhow. 15 Dawn of the Dead. The mother of all zombie movies. I am probably not raising eyebrows by putting this in here, more by not putting in higher. It's a sick jet black comedy horror with some astonishing gore. 14 Kingdom of the Spiders. I only discovered this in the last year or so, but had a fantastic time with it. Killer spiders take over a small town and began eating the populace, but Captain Kirk's having none of it. This is infinitely better than it sounds and a really great fun example of the nature gets pissed subgenre so popular in the 70s. 13 The Omen and Damien Omen 2. Cheating, I know, but these are two wonderfully iconic horror flicks with that iconic devil theme and a completely fictional invention, that 666 is the number of the devil, that people believe to this day. 12. Shivers. A luxury apartment complex becomes a terrifying trap when a parasite begins infecting the residents and turning them into lust-fueled maniacs in this creepy weirdo mid-70s chiller that was the feature debut of famed horror director David Cronenberg. It's obviously a low-budget flick, but equally obvious is Cronenberg's gift for conjuring an atmosphere of the bizarre and of brooding menace, and his fascination with all things creepy and disturbing. The 70s were just plain fucking weird, man. 11. The Man Who Haunted Himself. Roger Moore is a straight-laced businessman who suffers a near-fatal accident, only to return home to find strange things happening, strangers approaching him claiming to know him, even intimately, and friends and acquaintances claiming to have seen him in places he's never been. Is he going round the bend? Or does he really have a doppelganger who seems intent on taking over his life? Uncle Rog gives an intense performance in this creepy 1970 chiller that I really enjoyed. The Blu-ray has absolutely beautiful picture quality for a 47-year-old movie too. I was also deeply amused to find, 3 years before he became James Bond, Roger talking about industrial espionage and noting it's not all James Bond and Her Majesty's Secret Service, you know. 10. The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Texarkana in 1946 was a typical sleepy post-war American town, the kind of place where nothing ever happened, until a masked maniac began a sudden, inexplicable and brutal reign of murderous terror, making national headlines and sparking off one of the country's biggest ever manhunts. This chilling 70s horror, based on one of America's most notorious murder cases, has a strong cult following, and having finally gotten to see it, I can see why. Scary stuff that kept me gripped throughout. Very good indeed. 9. Dogs. In an isolated university town, a series of animal attacks on cattle leader Scruffy, a Surbic University professor, David McCallum, as excellent as always, to the alarming conclusion that ordinary domestic dogs are packing and turning savage, and they're about to graduate from cattle to people. This eerie mid-70s horror thriller has a very silly premise, but treats it with refreshing severity, and the result is a hugely entertaining and creepy film with plenty of shocks, scares and gore. 70s flicks always seem to get an extra 10 points of atmosphere added to them just because of the vibe, and Dogs is no exception. I have a very vague feeling that I may have seen this, or some of this, before as a kid. For some reason I keep imagining watching it on holiday in a caravan somewhere or other, but I really couldn't remember it. Very enjoyable. 8. Death Line, known in the US as Raw Meat. Donald Pleasance is an eccentric London police detective whose curiosity is piqued by the apparent disappearance of an OBE from a tube station. When 2 grisly slayings follow, it soon becomes apparent that the urban legends of feral, cannibalistic humans living underneath the city may be more fact than myth. This creepy early 70s British spine chiller is not massively well known these days, but does have a strong cult following, and I can see why. I enjoyed it. It's well made, well acted and rather disturbing, even more disturbing when you know the film was inspired by a real urban legend that grew up after some disturbing reports back in the 30s. Christopher Lee has an entertaining cameo as a particularly snotty government operative, and Pleasance's idiosyncratic character adds a touch of humor to a dark tale. 7. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The best version of this Hollywood favorite story of alien invasion and major league paranoia, with a fantastic cast including Donald Sutherland, Brooke Adams, Jeff Goldblum, Veronica Cartwright and Mr. fucking Spock. Awesome. 6. Theater of Blood. Vincent Price is a deranged ham actor who embarks on a campaign of murderous revenge against all the critics that ever slagged him off in this wickedly funny and macabre 70s British black comedy horror. Highly amusing, with a great turn from Price. His disguise as the camp hairdresser just about had me on the floor, and some surprisingly gruesome moments. Wonderfully warped. 5. The Brood. Art Hindle and Oliver Reed star in this creepy as hell late 70s horror thriller that is another entry from director David Cronenberg. Hindle is a father increasingly concerned for the safety of his little girl with her unstable mother, who is undergoing radical psychotherapy with a renowned shrink, Reed, who he reckons is a self-promoting quack. When his wife's parents are brutally murdered by a bizarre deformed child/dwarf/creature, his concerns continue to grow, and the terror is just beginning. This is a seriously messed up creepy weirdo 70s horror that I'd never seen before until last year, and absolutely loved to bits. This was my face during and after the climax. Cracking stuff. 4. Jaws. Some people may quibble as to whether Jaws really counts as a horror flick, but fuck them I say. It's about a bloody big sea monster that takes great delight in chowing down as many people as possible and is clearly being deliberately malevolent to boot. One of Spielberg's very best films and a classic in any decade. 3. Alien. An eternal classic. I saw this again just recently and it remains a phenomenal, unimpeachable classic. Just pure cinema. 2. Halloween. What more needs to be said about this classic frightener? It's still got it after over 40 years. A timeless horror classic that's still scary as all hell today. Carpenter's legendarily menacing score remains as potent as ever, and the voyeuristic camera work and notable lack of gloss give the whole thing an eerie fly-on-the-wall feel that makes it all disturbingly plausible. Classic 1. Black Christmas. Still not just my favorite 70s horror movie but quite possibly my all-time favorite horror movie. Black Christmas is wonderfully creepy and unsettling, with a wonderful cast including Olivia Hussey, Margot Kidder, hilarious as a foul-mouthed sorority sister, and the great John Saxon. I often forget how funny it is, though, as well, making me roar with laughter at some points. The humor, though, which serves to humanize the characters, just makes the insanity which is descending on them all the more frightening. The cinematography is gorgeous too, with the snowy winter landscape, the Christmassy warmth of the sorority house, in such stark contrast to the horror that will unfold there, and that cool early 70s ambience. List your own favorites, and don't have a hissy fit if they're not in here. This is my list. Not your list, not the BFI list, not the Guardian's list, or anyone else's. Mine. I look forward to sharing some more of my horror favorites in coming months.